Hey everyone, hope you're all doing well. Today I wanted to expand on an old idea I had from an old video where I threw out the idea of reviving the Van Buren design document and turning it into an outline for a sequel to New Vegas. That was primarily focused on the musical direction I had in mind for this concept, however in this video I wanted to do a deep dive into the factions and locations, etc. of what New Vegas 2 could look like using the Van Buren design documents as a guide. I think it works well as a general outline for New Vegas because between Fallout 1, 2, and New Vegas, we've already had plenty of insight into the NCR's sphere of influence, but as mentioned in my nitpicks of New Vegas video, I felt like the Legion was dealt a pretty poor hand gameplay-wise as they don't have a whole lot of territory or questing to do relative to many other factions in the game. Since Van Buren focuses on the four corner states of Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and Colorado, all of which have significant Legion presence/control in, this would of course alleviate that and give us a chance to see and interact with groups well within Caesar's area of control. In addition, for something as choice-driven as New Vegas, I think it would be a necessity to have the sequel be highly integrated, varied, and reactive to these choices that were in New Vegas. Setting the sequel in areas exclusively controlled by factions that you changed forever with your choices in New Vegas sets up that game to meet that goal very well in my opinion. Alright, so with all that intro stuff out of the way, let's get into the first chapter, gameplay mechanics. As far as a broad overview of the mechanics, it will be primarily using the original New Vegas mechanics with a few adjustments I'd like to see here and there. For example, outside of adjusting the science skill so that terminals don't lock you out after only 3 attempts, all other perks and skills from New Vegas would return exactly as they were in the original game. In addition, whilst it was possible to get to level 50 with the DLCs, in vanilla FNV the maximum level was only 30, that should be bumped up to 50 as the vanilla max level in the sequel, honestly, in my opinion. The weapons sandbox will likewise bring back everything from New Vegas, but with some additions to expand it even more. These include Cryo, which would be a new type of weapon like bullets, plasma, etc., except it would be using ice, obviously. Some crossbows, spears, and a decent quantity of shields. I'd also like to import the dual wield system in Skyrim, actually for melee builds to give them some more variety and flavor. Speaking of combat, I'd like to see a more consistent linear progression on enemy difficulty than FNV. I mean, looking at this graph, I had to draw it myself because I couldn't really find a good source online, and here on the x-axis are all the vanilla levels in game, and on the y-axis is the amount of enemies a player is an equal or higher level to at said specific level. And as you can see, the progression skyrockets in the middle levels, but really tapers out after the last third of vanilla levels. There's a bigger gap between levels 1 to 4 than there is between level 17 all the way until the max level. And that really fits honestly with my personal experiences of my New Vegas playthroughs. It feels like there's a huge difference exploring between when you're level 1 versus level 10, but like no distinction at all between level 20 and the max level 30 in the vanilla. So the obvious solution to that, in my opinion, is to spread out enemy difficulty more evenly, so ideally each level up will feel just as much, if not more rewarding than the last, rather than the less in New Vegas where it kind of flattens out at the end of the game. One other thing I'd like to bring into a sequel for New Vegas that's admittedly probably a lot more controversial than dual wielding would be a limited form of settlement construction. Now, nothing like Fallout 4 where honestly settlement construction has so much content it's arguably an entire game added on to Fallout 4, but a far more reduced and immersion-friendly result hopefully. So in this system, to bring settlers to a place there must be some buildings, ruins, etc. on site already, which while limiting choices for a player to utilize will help the development team curate each area far better to give the player far more experience, like a positive experience, a focused and immersive one, so that all possible settlements can, with some help, build a connection to say like rail and travel systems across the map and stuff and feel far more integrated and appropriate. And yes, that means I'd actually like to have usable railroads in this game. I hate that in New Vegas, they give us all these rail lines all across the map and model trains, but other than the monorail, which is highly restricted to any non-NCR player, we never go to do anything at all with them. In fact, I'd really like to upend the formula of free fast travel to any point in the world with a marker. Not too much, but a little bit. I would still let this system be available, but instead of it being free, it costs resources, such as like food, money, etc. And of course, the further you fast travel, the more resources it will use. And this will incentivize the players to take advantage of the rail system for transportation, as well as give non-survival players an actual reason to collect and care about food, which is almost effectively junk to many once they get enough money to have a good supply of stim packs. So ideally, between the low but consistent resource costs of fast travel and the ability to connect to whatever settlement the player could possibly build, players will be excited about and overjoyed, hopefully, to utilize the rail system. Now, any sequel to New Vegas that truly respects the outcomes of most possible player endings will necessarily have to adopt a similar system of integrating your previous choices in the prequel, as they did in, say, Witcher 3, for example. With this in mind, I think the entirety of all factions' areas of control at the start of the game should vary depending on what New Vegas ending that you're simulating. For those unfamiliar with the Van Buren design documents, many of these faction names are going to mean nothing to you, and one faction, a breakaway of Caesar's Legion, is entirely made up by me for this concept, but don't worry, later I'll give a broad overview of each as we're going through the areas. I'm showing this first primarily to give context for the rest of this video, so that way I'm not saying after every single sentence, depending on which ending you choose in New Vegas, this can vary, that'd get kind of annoying. So this first scenario is if you sided with the NCR. And given that, I think this scenario should have the most factions who have control of territory, as well as the least amount of territory for the Legion and its uprising offshoot. Down in New Mexico, this area is controlled by the reservation. This small dark green area on the borders of New Mexico and Colorado is the Ciphers. Above them in purple is the Daughters of Hecate. The Iron Rivers are in gray right here. This small area in the north of Colorado is the Boulder Dome, which is independent. Next to them, as you can see, coming south from Wyoming is the Great Khan's area of control. And yes, I'd be comfortable canonizing one ending over the other when it comes to lesser factions like the Great Khans. It's primarily in relation to the main story that I have a bigger problem with previous choices being erased. And then huddling around the Salt Lake is Jericho. The big area of blue here is the NCR area, as they definitely be pursuing the Legion on the other side of the Colorado River and pushing into the region. And lastly, the red and yellow areas are the two Legion factions, with the red being for the original Legion and the yellow being for the rebelling faction. Oh, I also have left this corridor of Utah blank in all three scenarios in case the player decided to save the Mojave Brotherhood of Steel chapter. If they did, then that's the area they'd have, but if not, then that would be taken over by the largest bordering faction, which in this particular scenario would be the NCR. I can see each of these scenarios I wrote independently, but afterwards I kind of went back and tried to find a historical analog to each roughly, and for this scenario I could see it having a lot of similarities to the collapse of the USSR. NCR merchants like the Crimson Van and Caravan Company and stuff are coming out, buying up all the businesses to have a monopoly, and much like how in the immediate aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union, most Russians struggled more than ever, I imagine for many people in Legion areas this scenario would be much the same. Some groups would be split on if they want to remain loyal to the Legion, got autonomy with it, or outright abandon it, much like many states formerly within the Soviet political sphere. Additionally, for all groups who claim independence from the collapsing region, what rules and boundaries will they set for themselves? I don't imagine they'd stick to whatever internal system of borders the Legion had. They're going to want their historic pre-Legion claims instead, which, given how much has probably changed between first being conquered and the Legion defeated Hoover Dam, will probably conflict with other groups at this point, also wanting independence from the Legion, which, for anyone who knows the post-Soviet history of the Caucasus or Central Asia, that sounds pretty familiar, doesn't it? Scenario 2 is for an independent New Vegas, regardless if you sided with House or Yes Men to achieve that. As you can see here, there are less factions controlling the area here, as without a total NCR victory, they haven't been able to put enough pressure, a lot of the smaller factions on the Legion, for them to lose control over as many places as before. The Ciphers, Iron Rivers, and Jericho are all no longer independent groups. However, as you can see here in Arizona, while the NCR wouldn't be nearly as dominant with a complete victory and annexation of New Vegas, I'd still have them pushing across the Colorado River into Legion territory a little bit. The reservation would also control less area than before. However, both Legion factions as well as the Daughters of Hegit control more territory in this scenario. This one's a lot harder to think of a good historical analog to the geopolitical setup of this scenario. Think kind of like a reverse Roman history, so rather than as a republic, then later turning into an empire, this is kind of the opposite scenario setup here. Caesar's Legion started as an empire and as introduced to us in New Vegas, but by the time of this game, a pro-republic faction, the rebelling one, of the Legion has risen up, and in this scenario, this middle scenario with the New Vegas victory, they'd arguably be more powerful than ever compared to the other two. If the Legion won at Hoover Dam, they wouldn't be weakened as much as this scenario for the pro-republic faction to resist, and on the other hand, if the NCR won, then they would arguably be the biggest challenge to both factions of the Legion, and several pro-republic resistors would just side with the NCR instead. Lastly, Scenario 3 is for a Legion victory at the Dam. In this scenario, the Legion fracture wasn't due to defeat, but rather expansion into California to try to annex the entirety of the NCR. Hence why the NCR have no territory in this scenario in the Four Corners states. Even then, despite being spread thin as much as they have pushed further and further west, both Legion factions in this scenario still control more territory than ever. I think the best analog for this one historically is Ireland during the 1900s, actually, with the sort of duality of an empire at the height of their power, whilst geographically right next door a pro-republican uprising is succeeding against this expansive empire that is actively defeating other large states in battles miles away. Of course, with the other historical analogs, they're obviously not one-to-one, nor, again, as I said earlier, was each written specifically to fit a historical analog, so I just kind of went back and reanalyzed them, so this was kind of the best one that I could fit for that one. But, by the way, all three of these starting scenarios take place only 3 years after the Battle of Hoover Dam, for those curious, and so regardless of if you killed or saved Caesar in FNB, just given his age, by now he would have passed. Again, either you killed him or due to natural causes, regardless, he's passed, and so that's part of the reason, well, one of the many reasons why there's so much faction revolts and civil conflict within the areas of Caesar's Legion. Unlike in Van Buren, where the southwest corner of the world is the most difficult and the northeast is the lower level starting area, this game is actually going to go with the exact opposite approach to fit story adjustments more adequately. Starting with the one spot in this world that this game would share with vanilla New Vegas, that being Hoover Dam, the dam shares the same design of dense buildings on it now that it has in the Van Buren design concept art for it, and in a couple of the starting scenarios it will be the main base in the game world for the NCR in this game. The settlement may or may not have power generation depending on the player's actions in FNV, and a handful of story scenarios need to be adjusted from the original Van Buren design document. For example, in this scenario, the Trogs simply don't exist, and it isn't the Brotherhood of Steel attacking the dam as they're not particularly close. They're not the ones putting pressure on the locals, but either Caesar's Legion or the Legion Republic. However, all characters and storylines, such as the conflict between the Crimson's Caravan and Threesome Caravan companies in the design doc, those remain unchanged. Depending on a combination of simulated save choices from FNV and in-game actions by the player in this sequel, the dam would have the most possible endings anywhere in the game at a whopping 10. Number 1, the NCR maintains control of the dam and prospers from the power sold. Or 2, the NCR continues to control the dam, but with no power it struggles to sustain the settlement upon it. 3, the dam is destroyed by the Legion Republic while it is under Caesar's Legion control to cut off reinforcements from the west trying to come back after campaigning in California. Number 4, the dam is destroyed by Caesar's Legion after having failed to capture it several times in order to disempower either New Vegas and or the NCR. Number 5, Caesar's Legion repair and control the dam, prospering from its power. 6, the Legion Republic are the ones who repair and control the dam, leading to wealth from the power sold for them. 7th, Caesar's Legion control the dam, but with no power the settlement on top is destroyed and abandoned ultimately. 8, the Legion Republic control it, but with no power or repairs the settlement is eventually abandoned and sits atop the dam as a ghost town. 9, New Vegas controls and maintains the dam well, leading to them having a lot of increase in income from that power generation. Or lastly, 10, New Vegas originally controlled the dam at the start of the game, but it was destroyed by one of the other factions in the world to weaken it. Bloomfield Space Center is almost entirely unchanged from the Van Buren design document, with the sole exception being Presper's plot as a side story rather than the main quest line, and he's not capable of destroying the entire world. He's only able to drop one missile and destroy one place. So being the place where one can launch into space to reach orbital bomb platforms, it makes it easily the second most important in the state, location-wise, besides Hoover Dam. The Grand Canyon likewise stays the same as the original Van Buren design document was in purpose and lore, a toxic area from all the uranium mining and all that, with lots of danger down there. The Tibbetts prison is no longer going to have so much to do with the main story, however, obviously, given its location along major rail lines in addition to some respawning loot, it should make this place, at the very least, the first place most players will have a chance to engage with the settlement mechanics, given that it's the only spot in Arizona where they can build. And in all three starting scenarios, Flagstaff is going to be a frontier of Caesar's legions as a fortress of theirs that can either provide a thorough battle area to those who are going to be opposing the Caesar's legion, or an important first major supply of resources, traders, etc. for players who are positive or at the very least neutral with Caesar's legion. Lastly, the Hassayampa River Valley doesn't have any settlement there, however it is where the players would start the game in a recently flooded desert canyon. We'll get to that towards the end. As with New Vegas, the player is of course free to take any path throughout the world that their character can accomplish, but assuming one were to go in order from least to most difficult regions in the game linearly, for the sake of this video at least, then New Mexico would be the second place the player enters in it, with it being home to the central base of the reservation. Much like in the Van Buren design document, Dr. Clark runs the faction in a location of the same name as the faction, and intends to conquer the world for ghouls. In fact, unlike several factions which need slight adjustments to fit into the canon of what we learned the Legion did to them in New Vegas, the reservation as a faction and location can, and in my opinion should, just be entirely unchanged. This includes all their possible ending slides, which ranged from the player assisting Clark's plan to take over the world, to usurping Clark and replacing him with a more human-friendly ghoul, to outright destroying the entire faction if the player was powerful enough and chose to do so. However, closer to the border with Arizona, the player is far more likely to first hit one of three minor locations. The southernmost is Old Horse Springs, which only exists thanks to the spring well being the only well not dried up in the area for miles, and thus any human life in the area doesn't really have anywhere else to settle. North of that is Pie Town, which yes, is a real-world place, and unsurprisingly I think it would be great to just make it a small 3 to 5 building settlement that just revolves around pies. I don't know, maybe it's a pie religion or something, and they only eat different forms of pie for every meal of the day, so like pot pie and stuff for dinner, and then all the sweeter pies like pumpkin and blueberry and stuff are the only desserts they're allowed to eat. I don't know, I just think there's something fun that you could do there idea-wise. And then lastly, even further north than that, is this ancient volcanic landscape, which honestly is so cool not to do something with. And what I was thinking is making all the volcanoes active again, not so much so that they all explode, but enough so that at night you can see like lava rivers and stuff glowing in the dark, and see entrances to lava tubes down below, which will be filled with Gehenna, one of the cut mutants from Van Buren, which I would have spread to multiple areas around like that have basically any caves that are fiery. We're going to have the Gehenna in this game. And beyond that is Albuquerque, which although not near a total ghost town like Phoenix, which is in Arizona and is thoroughly abandoned, just sort of a skeleton area of buildings and concrete, it's still relatively desolate, but it has a river running through the area, and the train line connection keeps Albuquerque alive. The last miscellaneous location in New Mexico is Wheeler Peak, which I thought would be a good location to give the players a view of the surrounding landscape from a scenic viewpoint, because there aren't really any good high points anywhere else near it to do so. Lastly is the Sims Mesa campground, which I cooked up into a full settlement on here rather than simply being a campground, primarily so that New Mexico could have a major settlement that isn't controlled by the reservation. With the nearby lake providing all the water a town would need, with several others nearby as well, they have plenty to entice travelers and bring in trade, in my opinion, across the area. In two scenarios, it's a major Legion Republic site, being their only one of control in the entire state, or maybe one of only 2 settlements controlled by the Cipher tribe in the other starting scenario who remain unchanged from the Van Buren design document, writing equations on themselves, working math formulas into their speech, and outright religiously worshipping numbers. After wrapping up most tasks in New Mexico, most players would head up to Utah, which has 6 miscellaneous locations as well as potentially as many as 4 faction capitals. In the southern reaches of the state are half of the miscellaneous locations, with Fort Abandon in the southeast and 2 national parks to the west of it, these being Zion and Escalante National Parks respectively. The former is in there as a callback to the Honest Hearts DLC from Fallout New Vegas, whilst the latter serves as a midpoint between Maxim Bunker and the main rail lines for if any Brotherhood of Steel line players wanted to extend the rails to their faction's home base in the game. North of the 2 national parks is Fort Delta, a former Caesar's Legion base meant to help them wield control over central Utah, but now serves as a frontier fort for either the NCR or the Legion Republic. Located where the modern town of Delta, Colorado is. That's where Fort Delta is, by the way. Northeast of that is Burham Springs, which, outside of being part of the rail system connecting Jericho to Grand Junction, is pretty much the same as in the Van Buren design document. A small, mostly abandoned mining town populated by a handful of untrusting locals who hang on. The last miscellaneous location in the state is Desert Peak, which serves as a great viewpoint, kind of like Wheeler Peak did, being the only good viewpoint in that area. This one serves as a really great viewing spot for the city of Jericho and sort of just the entire Salt Lake area in general, which sits right there on the edge of the game world. Despite being an overall relatively not super breezy locations, I think just given its location, it would be important enough for the nearby factions to deserve a series of ending slides depending on the outcome of choices the players have with it, and which of the 4 end up taking control of Burham Springs. If the Great Khans capture it, the town never expands or gets repaired, making life there still hard. However, on the other hand, they do get a relatively high amount of political autonomy. Under the Legion Republic, the town would be repaired, but due to no political autonomy whatsoever and the little power of a town of single digits of inhabitants and their type of system, their type of republican system at least, would ultimately be abandoned. Under Caesar's Legion, the town would be fixed, but the inhabitants would be exiled for rebelling or exercising any independence whatsoever, and replaced by citizen settlers from the Legion. The Daughters of Hecate, if able to capture the town, would have no interest in populating or repairing it, allowing it to become abandoned, as long as it isn't used as a site against them by any opposing faction. They could care less about it, honestly. And then lastly, if the Iron Rivers managed to take over the town, then the town would be repaired and become part of a smaller faction almost immediately, and quickly become the second most important town outside of only their capital itself. As far as faction capitals in Utah are concerned, the southernmost is Maxim Bunker. Now, depending on what choices you simulate from FNV, this may or may not be a faction capital at all, actually, if the Brotherhood of Steel were destroyed by the player's courier in the previous game. But assuming the players spared them in New Vegas, they would find, as far as members are concerned at least, that the Brotherhood of Steel is in an even more dire state here than they were in Hidden Valley. As mentioned earlier, with Hoover Dam, unlike in the original Van Buren design document, the Brotherhood wouldn't be obviously attacking Hoover Dam from up here. And another change would be that while the Circle of Steel storyline in the design document would still be here, the player wouldn't be able to join the Circle of Steel. I just think this outline already has so many factions that you can aid in it that it may become too overwhelming to add even more joinable factions for coding and writing purposes. So we would need at least a few factions that are just like hostile to all players, kind of like the Fiends are. And I think the Circle of Steel, I think they could fit that role really well, actually. I'm envisioning 4 different endings for the Brotherhood in this game, depending on a combination of simulated save choices and player-driven in-game choices. Ending number 1, the Mojave chapter expands into Utah, permanently settling control over nearly the entire state. Ending number 2, the Mojave chapter are able to sustain their current hold in Utah, but are unable to expand, staying relatively close to the Nevada border. Ending number 3, the Mojave chapter are not destroyed, but are absorbed/allied into the ever-expanding NCR. Lastly, ending number 4, the Brotherhood in Utah are destroyed and sent packing. The Ouroboros, unlike Maxim Bunker, is essentially one-for-one with its design document counterpart. being filled with all the same quest opportunities and NPCs, as well as the center of power for the Daughters of Hecate. I wouldn't necessarily change the Daughters of Hecate, but I'd expand on their lore to make them a sort of interesting Venn diagram comparison with Caesar's Legion. So both factions are authoritarian, militaristic, assimilationist, expansionist, non-secular, and inspired heavily by ancient cultures. However, they're on opposing sides of the spectrum when it comes to just as many things. Hecate's followers are pro-literacy, matriarchal, anti-slavery, use Greek titles of phrases, and lastly are using the colors of blue and silver in their symbolism. While Caesar's Legion is obviously very anti-literacy, patriarchal, pro-slavery, uses Latin titles of phrases, and of course uses the colors red and gold. Much like the Legion, Hecate has also absorbed several formerly separate tribes, and one under her control is the Vipers, who can go one of two ways depending on how the player handles them. They may either A, stay loyal to Hecate as her personal guard, or they may, with great effort at the very least, be convinced to betray Hecate, which leads to her faction disbanding. As far as endings for the Daughters of Hecate are concerned, there are 4. First, as just mentioned, Hecate can be stabbed in the back by the Vipers, ultimately leading to the faction dissolving. Second, they may accept annexation from the Great Khans in order to avoid being forcefully disbanded by the NCR, Caesar's Legion, or Legion Republic. Of course, another outcome may be that they are able to absorb one of those 2 warring factions in the Legion and end up in a stalemate situation with the other, resulting in a sort of new status quo, so to speak. And then the last one would be if, with a lot of help from the player, they may be able to conquer both Legion factions, which would result in them being easily by far the most powerful faction in the region by the endgame slides. The Great Khan base serves as a supply outpost and center for operations of the Great Khan raids into Utah and New Mexico. Traders from any faction who are welcome, they're all welcome here. However, given its remoteness, only the nearby factions are going to really have any traders that you'll see here. They have 3 possible endings. Firstly, they may be wiped out and kicked out of the region. Alternatively, they can forcefully conquer several nearby tribes and take over most of northern Utah and Colorado, forcing both Legion factions to relocate their capitals further south for safety. Lastly, they could negotiate or ally with several of the smaller local tribes as hinted at earlier instead, defeating both Legion factions and getting several smaller groups such as the Daughters of Hecate and Boulder Dome Scientists to willingly accept annexation with significant political autonomy in exchange. The last possible faction capital in Utah is Jericho, which arguably has the most backstory in the original design document, and given that, I'd like to keep as much of that unchanged as possible, with the only differences being the removal of Joshua Graham from the area, because as we saw in Honest Hearts, he's down in the Zion Park area doing some work there, and also the depiction of him in FNV was just rather different from the original writing of his character in Van Buren. Jericho is the largest settlement in the state and the only settlement on the shores of the Great Salt Lake with 4 possible endings. As far as the player has the option to destroy the settlement entirely, that's obviously one ending. Of course, other nefarious players can achieve the same goal by, rather than fighting the entire town, just destroying the water supply, slowly resulting in it becoming a ghost town over the years. The third type of outcome is the town isn't destroyed or abandoned, however it is conquered by one of the several factions interested in it, who of course replace the formerly independent leadership. And lastly, with a lot of work and some decent negotiating, the town can be outright independent and thrive. However, this outcome would of course take the most amount of effort from the player. Lastly, Colorado has by far the most amount of locations and stuff to do in this outline, as it will take up most if not all of the later game for many players. Lookout Peak is going to serve the same purpose as the other mountain peaks, providing a great view of the landscape for all players in the area of southwest Colorado. The Twin Mothers are absorbed into the Daughters of Hecate in all starting scenarios, but elsewise remain unchanged to the Van Buren design documents as far as characters and quests are concerned. More towards central Colorado is Colorado Springs, which serves as the midpoint on the rail line connecting the Caesar's Legion capital at Fort Mason, or at least the current one at the start of this game, and Grand Junction, which is the meeting point of all major rail networks in the world here. However, during the start of all 3 scenarios, it is occupied by the Legion Republic, who have cut off Caesar's Legion from all rail transit to the rest of the rail system. And then Aspen is going to be an abandoned ski town that serves as a very mountainous and snowy option for players to build settlements at. Whereas the last non-faction capital of the state, the Nursery, is home to an autonomous tribe under the rule of the Great Khans who remain elsewise unchanged from the Van Buren design documents as well, and the Nursery will ultimately have 3 different possible endings. Number 1, the player either ignores the Nursery entirely or actively attacks it, leading to the site being abandoned and the group becoming extinct. Number 2, the facility is restored, but the player is able to convince the tribe to replace Diana, leading to a less isolationist leader that helps spread their medical knowledge and farming techniques rapidly across the wasteland. Or, finally, option 3, or ending number 3, Diana and the facility are both fully restored, and she retains control of the tribe. She does spread medical and farming knowledge ultimately, but given Diana's overprotectionist tendencies, it is a rather slow process. The southernmost faction capital in Colorado is Mesa Verde. Just like in the Van Buren design documents, this is home to the previously mentioned Cipher tribe. Regardless if they were independent or not, the characters and quests available to the player in the settlement would remain unchanged. There are 4 possible endings for them. First off, they could be forcibly conquered and absorbed into the Daughters of Hecate. Another outcome could be that they are conquered by Caesar's Legion, but in that scenario they aren't just annexed and assimilated, but are outright all killed for rebelling against the Legion in the first place. If they happen to side with the Legion Republic against Caesar's Legion and they are successful in that conflict, then alternatively the Ciphers will, while no longer being independent, be allowed to maintain their culture, internal political system, etc. within the Republic. Lastly, with help from the player, they may be able to maintain their outright independence and resist all surrounding factions to take them over, but only in the starting scenario where they are having control of their surrounding territory. On the opposite end of the state, the northernmost faction capital in Colorado is the Boulder Dome, home to the Boulder Dome scientists, whom start unknowingly all carrying the new plague, just as Presper has planned. This ties into the portions of his nefarious plot from Van Buren we'd bring over to this game, and the scientists, who are all technically working under him as a faction, have a few different outcomes. If any other faction manages to conquer the Boulder Dome, then all scientists in the dome, already being skeptical of Presper, will swear allegiance to the new conquerors over Presper, effectively ending the faction's existence. Or if Presper is able to retain control of the faction, then Presper ultimately tricks the scientists into causing havoc for the entire surrounding area, kind of like the Big MT in Old World Blues if you think about it. Alternatively, if you help G overthrow Presper, she's going to end up radically realigning the group to start actually helping people with the research, rather than finding more ways to destroy them. And then another place, as mentioned earlier, is Grand Junction, and that's the central point for rail connecting all the rail lines across the 4 corner states, and the Iron Rivers call it their capital/home. Much like the more nomadic version of them than the design documents, they will use the rails and stuff to actively travel across the area and have built their entire culture and religion around worshipping the railroad. The major difference here is that the location of Circle Junction, their original location in the Van Buren design documents, is in northeast Colorado, but here to make it more central to the rail system of the game, I put it at Grand Junction, which is in western Colorado. Given the importance of the location, almost all possible endings see the tribe either wiped out or at the very least absorbed into the conquering force, of which there are half a dozen the player can choose between, with the only possible ending that gives them outright independence in the ending slides being a combination of the NCR victory at Hoover Dam starting scenario, as that's the only one where they start off controlling their own nearby area, and the player following a very specific path of choices that empowers both the Iron Rivers enough for them to maintain independence, whilst at the same time not aggravating any of the larger bordering powers. The last 2 locations are Denver and Fort Morgan. Fort Morgan serves as the capital of Caesar's Legion in the game and is the most well-fortified and manned location in the entire game. If you're not already well-liked by Caesar's Legion, then players won't even be able to walk up to the gates before being told to turn back, much less get in. Denver, on the other hand, is an entirely independent document. For Van Buren, they wrote so much about it, and most of which I'd like to keep. It's got the nickname Dogtown on that, but we would just call it Denver in this design document. The big change would be that the NCR scrappers and their storyline are replaced by members of the Legion Republic instead, a breakaway faction of Caesar's Legion who mostly follow the same principles as before when they were part of Caesar's Legion, but they are pro-Republic, pro-literacy, and anti-slavery. However, they're still incredibly militaristic, patriarchal, etc. So it's not like they're not just basically like, what if Caesar's Legion was less bad? They're a little bit more complicated than that. That's why I thought their flag should look like this, the same colors, just reversed in provenance. Herd of bison to symbolize the republican nature of their movement, rather than the relative, individual bull for Caesar's Legion. Both warring factions have 4 main categories of endings possible, with subtle variations within each type of ending depending on the exact choices of the player. So for Caesar's Legion, the first is full conquest of the 4 corner states, reestablishing their brutal control and punishing all the rebelling tribes for trying to exert independence. Another is both them and the Legion Republic fight to a stalemate, causing neither to be destroyed or expanded. The third type results in them conquering the Legion Republic, but due to the drain on resources that caused, they are unable to reclaim anywhere else in the area. Lastly, they can be conquered/destroyed themselves by a plethora of factions who despise them. The Legion Republic, on their end, shares the same types of endings, but of course, obviously in their favor rather than in the favor of Caesar's Legion. Before we conclude with my outline ideas for our main story, let's briefly go over the companions I'd like to see in this game from the Van Buren design documents. Alexandra, the Legion bounty hunter, finds herself in the same starting scenario and area as the Van Buren area or design document, but with the addition that as far as the Legion Civil War is concerned, she sides with the Legion Republic specifically. Her character quest involves you taking her back to Jericho and helping her find peace about her lost family. Karisu, who is Sulik's sister, has the same backstory as in Van Buren, but in this case, her history is with Caesar's Legion instead of the original faction she was meant to be a part of in the design document. She is pro-Caesar's Legion as far as it comes to Legion Civil War, and her character quest involves finding out whatever you can about the fate of her original tribe and her brother. Battery, the Cypher, is largely unchanged from the design documents as well, but he's going to be located in the Cypher's home base at the start of the game instead of Jericho. His character quest requires the player to bring electric power to every major settlement in the region. Ji, or Jian, the Boulder Dome scientist, remains almost entirely unchanged, with the one exception being that if you have her take over the Boulder Dome scientist, she leaves your party so she can stay there to attend to her new responsibilities. Bear and the Rusty Hooks are almost entirely unchanged, except that they're in Jericho instead of Bloomfield and they currently run the town. Given this, Bear can effectively act as a Jericho faction companion if Jericho is independent and players wish to side with them. His character quest is also the same as in the design documents. Beatrice retains her previous backstory and has moved to Grand Junction instead of her previous location to work under the Iron Rivers, thus making her an ideal companion for players who are aligned with them. Her character story involves involves getting the player to fight for more super mutant rights in general in the human-run settlements. Otto Steed, the Ghoul Engineer, keeps the Hoover Dam running functional, but he's growing bored of it. His character story is actually the way you unlock his companionship in the first place, which is figure out how to automate repairs on the dam so that his overwatch is no longer needed. Measles, the Born Ghoul, is just straight up exactly the same and is part of the Reserve faction, loyal to Dr. Clark. CRBS, the Cerberus prototype companion, is mostly the same as in Van Buren, except the player is able to, with enough science skill, craft a better battery, allowing the unit to leave the Denver area with the player instead of being limited to it. Lastly, one returning companion from a previous game I would like to bring would be Raoul from FNV. The story here would be he got captured by the Great Khans and taken with them as they left for Wyoming, but since then he's actually become a high-ranking member of theirs and has actually come to enjoy his position in the group. He then came south with the raiding parties and at the start of the game can be found at the Great Khan's camp. With all the locations and faction detailed, we can finally get into the main storyline. The start of this game would have an intro cutscene which will have the player starting as a captured prisoner in a chain line of Caesar's Legion, marching through the Hassayampa River Valley towards Flagstaff to the north. A flash flood suddenly rages through the valley. During the chaos, the player is nearly drowning as they are chained up to all these other people when one legionary who stood out by being in yellow instead of red, a subtle hint he was a Legion Republic defector, He swims towards you in the flood and breaks the player free from their chains before he himself is swept downstream with everyone else, thus leaving the player alone on the shoreline of the valley with nothing but the clothes on their back to begin the game, and a quest indicator encouraging players to go down the river and see what happened to that guy who saved them, but of course, they can ignore that at first if they wish to. But eventually, if they do wish to begin the main quest line, they have to either go find him and speak to him, or they could kill him, I guess. Once this is done, if the player gets a note/comment, or the player will get a note, /comment noting the concerns about signs of a disease starting to spread from far northern Colorado. At this point, the new plague, which has similar effects and backstory to its design document version, will become an active disease in the game, originating at the point of Boulder Dome and spreading outwards slowly from there with a roughly, I don't know, maybe 10 to 15% infection rate upon proximity with an infected NPC. And then eventually, after an in-game week or two, it would become enough of a concern for faction leaders to bring it up with the player. This sets the player on an investigation to first find out how it spreads. And then once the player discovers it's airborne and shares that information, they will next be sent to find the origin point of the disease, which, as we mentioned, is the Boulder Dome, and the player would eventually find that out. And then at this point, the player can follow several different plans, either ignoring the plague until it starts devastating the majority of the world's in-game population, which results in an ending slide where all, if not nearly all, of human life in the Four Corner states becomes extinct. Or if it is still relatively geographically isolated, then one can look into a quarantine plan that will doom all those infected to death, causing economic and environmental collapse across the region. However, they would technically destroy the new plague. Or they could also do a combination of slow vaccine rollout and regional quarantines to eventually wipe out the new plague. Or lastly, if the player is able to mass produce a vaccine and make it easily accessible, then they would quickly destroy the new plague. So yeah, as you can tell, this was an idea I had a lot of fun with. Huge thank you to everyone who enjoyed my rambling ideas. For whatever reason, these New Vegas ideas turned out way bigger than I intended. I thought this would be like a 10-page script, and it turned out to be 25 pages and over 7,000 words, so yeah. Love you all, and I hope you have a lovely day.